The ballroom shimmered under the glow of chandeliers, a sea of crisp uniforms, polished metals, and muted conversations. It was the annual Navy Heritage Banquet, an evening meant to honor tradition, valor, and sacrifice. Tables were lined with white linen, glasses of champagne sparkled under the light, and laughter mingled with the clinking of cutlery. Retired veterans swapped old war stories, their voices hoarse yet proud, while young recruits listened wide-eyed, clinging to every word as though the past might lend them courage for the future. It was supposed to be a night of unity, a reminder that the Navy family extended far beyond the battlefield. Then the doors opened and the atmosphere fractured. Two military police officers entered with mechanical precision, their boots striking the polished floor like gunfire. The sound cut through the hum of conversation. Heads turned, voices faltered, and within seconds, silence swallowed the room. Between the two MPs walked a figure who did not belong in restraints. Not here, not tonight. Commander Alexandra "Alex" Morgan. Her name had once echoed in every SEAL training facility, whispered with awe by those who endured Hell Week and drowned under the weight of endless training. She had been the impossible story, the woman who did what others said could never be done, earn the trident, survive combat tours, and become one of the most lethal snipers in Navy history. And yet here she was, her wrists bound by cold steel. Gasps rippled across the banquet hall. One young sailor, hardly out of his teens, whispered too loudly, "That's her. That's Commander Morgan." His words hung in the air like a warning flare, and soon whispers ignited from every corner of the room. Alex walked with the same steadiness she had carried through desert storms and jungle mud, her back straight, her face expressionless. But the handcuffs betrayed her. Their metallic glint mocked her legacy. They rattled softly with every step, a sound that felt louder than the applause that had once greeted her at award ceremonies. The MPs guided her forward, but she was no fragile prisoner being dragged. She moved as if she still commanded the pace, her boots striking the ground with a controlled rhythm. She did not look left or right, though she could feel the stares burning into her. She did not bow her head in shame, though the weight of 100 judgments pressed on her shoulders. For the audience, time fractured. To the young recruits, this was impossible. A hero unmasked, a legend reduced to disgrace. They had read her name in training manuals, studied her missions in whispered lessons that were off the record. She was proof that impossible barriers could be broken. And now she was in chains. If she could fall, what hope did they have? To the older veterans, the sight was different. They exchanged heavy glances, their expressions carved with the memory of choices no outsider could ever understand. They had seen heroes punished, scapegoats created, sacrifices buried under classified seals. Some frowned in disapproval at her arrest. Others simply lowered their gaze, unwilling to pass judgment without knowing the truth. Alex herself gave nothing away. Her eyes remained forward, steady, sharp as the crosshairs she once peered through. Her silence was louder than the whispers surrounding her. It was the silence of someone who had learned to wait out storms, who had survived interrogations harsher than this parade of shame. The MPs led her past tables lined with officers in dress whites, past admirals whose chests glittered with ribbons, past sailors who had once dreamed of meeting her as an honored guest, not a prisoner. The air thickened with tension. Conversations had not merely stopped, they had died. Even the chandeliers above seemed dimmer, their golden light no longer soft and celebratory, but harsh, clinical, exposing. Halfway across the hall, Alex caught the faintest reflection of herself in the mirrored wall. A soldier in full dress uniform, rows of ribbons glinting proudly, and beneath them the bite of steel cutting into her wrists. For a moment she saw the irony. A decorated warfighter displayed like evidence. Why now? Someone muttered from the back of the room. The question echoed unspoken in every mind. Why bring her here, on this night of all nights? If the Navy wished to bury her quietly, there were quieter ways. But this was deliberate, public, a message. The MPs halted near the center of the hall. Alex stood tall between them, though the chains pulled slightly at her shoulders. She didn't resist, didn't speak. Her stillness carried more defiance than any outburst could. A captain at one of the nearby tables pushed back his chair and stood, his face pale. "This is a disgrace," he hissed under his breath. She bled for this country. Others remained seated, paralyzed between loyalty and obedience. And still, Alex said nothing. The commanding officer of the MPs stepped forward, his voice sharp as steel. "Commander Alexandra Morgan is in custody, pending review of charges." He said no more. He didn't have to. The words landed like a detonation. Charges against her. The room erupted not in noise, but in silence deeper than before. No one dared to clap. No one dared to object. Even those who disagreed held their tongues. It was not just a matter of respect. It was fear. The Navy did not handcuff its legends lightly. Alex finally lifted her gaze, not to the officer, not to the MPs, but to the crowd. For the first time since entering the room, her eyes swept across the faces staring back at her. Some looked away, ashamed. Others held her gaze, trying to find in her expression the truth the Navy refused to share. And in that instant, she felt it again, the old battlefield calm. The world slowed, the noise faded, and all that remained was clarity. She had lived through nights darker than this. She had seen men crumble under pressure, had been the steady hand in chaos, the voice that steadied the team. Tonight, she would be no different. If they wanted to parade her as a criminal, she would walk like a soldier. Her silence became a weapon. The MPs shifted uncomfortably beside her, as though even they sensed that she was not their prisoner. They were merely escorts in a play none of them understood. In the far corner of the room, the doors opened once more. A hush deeper than silence fell. Every head turned. Admiral James Harrington entered. And in that moment, the room itself seemed to stop breathing. The Admiral's arrival sucked the air out of the room. But before his words could redefine the night, memories of Alex Morgan's past surged through the minds of everyone present. Her name was not just a name, it was a legend etched into the DNA of the Navy SEALs. Alex had been an anomaly from the start. When she entered Bud Sin, the brutal training pipeline that broke men twice her size, most thought she wouldn't last the first week. The Pacific surf, cold and merciless, swallowed many who dared step into it. Yet Alex never quit. While others collapsed from exhaustion, she pushed forward, steady as a shadow. Her instructors threw every ounce of pressure at her, demanding more push-ups, longer swims, impossible obstacle times. Instead of breaking, she sharpened. By Hell Week's end, when bodies lay shivering and broken on stretchers, Alex emerged standing. Her face was pale, her lips blue, but her eyes were alive, burning with the fire of someone who refused to yield. That fire carried her into the teams. Her first deployment was in Afghanistan. In a valley where insurgents blended with civilians, she became the quiet hunter. Her rifle spoke where words could not. From nearly a mile away, she could neutralize threats before they knew death was coming. Yet she was no reckless killer. She studied wind, light, terrain, and most of all consequences. Her teammates often joked that Alex didn't just shoot to hit. She shot to protect. One night, her platoon was pinned down in an ambush. Bullets screamed through the air, ripping into the mud walls around them. Panic crept in, even among seasoned operators. But Alex, perched on a rooftop with her rifle, was unshaken. She calmly called out wind corrections, her voice steady over the comms. One by one, she eliminated the shooters. By dawn, the valley was silent again. Her team survived because she had kept her heartbeat steady while chaos raged. From that mission onward, she wasn't just Morgan. She was the sniper. The one who could turn the tide of a fight with a single trigger pull. Her legend grew across continents. In jungles, she lay still for 48 hours, unmoving as ants crawled across her body, waiting for the perfect shot. In frozen mountains, she endured frostbite just to protect her brothers in arms. Her name spread in whispers, sometimes among allies, sometimes among enemies. Entire villages spoke of the ghost-eyed woman who could strike without warning. Yet Alex never sought the spotlight. At ceremonies, she stood in the back row, her medals pinned neatly but never flaunted. In briefings, she spoke only when necessary, her words clipped, precise. For her, the mission was everything. Glory meant nothing, but legends come with shadows. Her career ended not with celebration, but with questions. At first, no one knew why she retired so suddenly. The official Navy statement was vague. Commander Morgan completed her years of honorable service. There was no farewell speech, no glowing tribute. Just silence. Those who asked were told, "It's classified." But rumors are oxygen in military circles, and soon the whispers began. She disobeyed an order. She refused to take the shot. She let the target escape. Others told a different story. She saved lives by breaking the rules. The intel was wrong, and she refused to carry out a mistake. No one knew which version was true. All they knew was that a warrior who had given everything walked away with nothing but silence. Now, seeing her in handcuffs, the whispers returned, sharper, louder, heavier. A young ensign at one of the tables leaned toward his mentor, an old chief who had served 20 years. "Chief, what did she do? Why would they arrest her?" The chief didn't answer immediately. He stared at Alex, his jaw clenched. Finally, he muttered, "Sometimes the truth ain't what the Navy wants you to believe. Sometimes heroes carry the blame, so the system doesn't." The ensign frowned. "So she could be innocent?" The chief looked at him, eyes hard. "Or guilty. But either way, she earned those scars. Don't judge until you've stood where she has." Across the room, a group of older SEALs shifted uneasily. They knew fragments of the classified mission that had ended her career. A compound in a Middle Eastern city, a suspected high-value target, orders to eliminate at all costs. Alex had been the sniper on Overwatch, but instead of pulling the trigger, she'd hesitated. Minutes later, the mission spiraled into confusion. Reports claimed civilians had been inside. Others claimed the target had fled because of her delay. The truth was locked away behind steel doors and red tape. And now she stood in chains, the Navy dragging her back into the spotlight she had once avoided. Alex's own mind, however, was not in the past. She had lived every mission twice already, once in the field, once in her memory. Each choice replayed endlessly in her dreams, each trigger pull haunting her long after the sound had faded. She carried those ghosts silently, without complaint. Tonight was no different. Her face revealed nothing as the MPs held her in place, but inside, she knew the storm was gathering. Her story was no longer just hers. It belonged to every person watching. Some saw her as a fallen angel. Others saw her as a scapegoat. And a few, perhaps the wisest, saw her as what she truly was. A soldier who had made impossible choices in impossible moments. The silence in the hall grew heavier with every passing second. Everyone waited for the Admiral to speak, but before he did, the weight of her legacy pressed down on them all. Because no matter what charges were spoken, no matter what accusations were hurled, nothing could erase the truth of what Alex Morgan had been. A warrior, a protector, a sniper whose legend had been forged in shadows and fire. and now a prisoner. The contrast was unbearable. The Admiral's voice would come soon, but until then, the room lived in the echo of her past, trapped between awe and doubt, pride and shame. Alex remained silent, her gaze locked forward, carrying the same calm she had carried in deserts, jungles, and frozen peaks. The calm of someone who knew the storm wasn't over. It had only just begun. The clink of Alex Morgan's chains seemed to echo endlessly, as though the ballroom itself had turned into an amplifier for her humiliation. She stood in the center of the great hall, flanked by the MPs, her posture erect, her gaze fixed forward. The chandeliers sparkled above her, indifferent, as if mocking the gravity of the moment. But the people inside the room were far from indifferent. Not a single glass moved, not a single fork scraped across porcelain. Conversations had not merely faded. They had died entirely. The hush was suffocating, as though every breath held weight. It was a silence unlike any other one born, not of peace, but of tension, so taut that it threatened to snap. Young sailors and junior officers, who had entered the banquet full of eagerness and reverence for the heroes around them, now sat stiff in their seats. Their eyes darted from the handcuffs to Alex's unreadable face, as if trying to reconcile two impossible truths: that a woman they had studied in textbooks as a trailblazer, a role model, a symbol of perseverance, was now being paraded as a criminal. One ensign shifted nervously, whispering to the man beside him, "Why aren't they saying anything? Why isn't anyone explaining this?" The older lieutenant beside him gave a curt shake of the head, eyes locked on Alex, because sometimes silence speaks louder than words. The ensign frowned, not understanding. But he could feel that something was happening here that went far beyond a simple arrest. Across the hall, clusters of veterans exchanged guarded looks. Men with silver hair and weathered faces, who had fought their wars in jungles and deserts decades earlier, stared at Alex with a mixture of pity and respect. They knew what it meant to carry scars invisible to civilians. They knew what it meant to live under the weight of classified missions, forbidden to defend yourself against whispers and rumors. One retired Master Chief leaned toward his peer, his voice low. "She doesn't look broken," the other man nodded. "That's because she isn't." Indeed, Alex's posture told its own story. Though her wrists were bound, she carried herself with a poise that even the handcuffs could not diminish. Her chin was level, her shoulders squared. She was no cowering prisoner awaiting judgment. She was a soldier, standing in the storm, refusing to yield. Her silence was more than defiance. It was strategy. She had learned long ago that silence unnerves people more than words. Enemies expected curses, pleas, bargaining. When none came, they began to doubt themselves. And now, in this hall filled with admirals, captains, and recruits, her refusal to acknowledge shame unsettled everyone who looked upon her. It was as if she were asking them, without speaking, "Do you really know what you're seeing? Do you understand the cost of your judgment?" The MPs shifted uncomfortably beside her. They were trained professionals, accustomed to escorting prisoners, but this was different. Their prisoner wasn't some nameless soldier caught in misconduct. She was a decorated SEAL, a sniper whose reputation even they had grown up hearing about. The weight of escorting her pressed against them like a moral burden. One of them stole a glance at her, then quickly looked away. Even in chains, her presence was commanding. The silence dragged on, heavier with each passing second. The Admiral had not yet spoken, and without his voice, the room was trapped in a limbo of tension. Every tick of the clock on the far wall seemed thunderous. Then came the whispers. They started small. A hiss at one table, a murmur at another. "She disobeyed orders," one man muttered. "That's what I heard." "No," someone else countered softly. "She refused to take the shot." Civilians were inside. She saved lives. How do you know that? I don't. No one does. The whispers spread like cracks through glass, carrying speculation and suspicion. Some glances toward Alex were sharp with disapproval, others soft with sympathy. But none dared to raise their voices fully. The silence was a battlefield now. Alex, however, seemed untouched by it. She kept her eyes forward, her breathing even. The weight of 100 judgments did not bend her. If anything, the silence gave her strength. It reminded her of nights in deserts when the world went still before the storm, of moments in jungles when the enemy lurked unseen. She had learned to be patient in those silences, to trust her discipline when others panicked. She let the room stew in its uncertainty. In the back row, a civilian guest, an old war correspondent who had embedded with SEAL teams years before, watched her closely. He scribbled notes on a napkin, not for publication, but for his own memory. He had seen that same expression on soldiers' moments before firefights, an expression that said, "I am not afraid. Whatever comes, I have already lived it once in my head." The MPs exchanged a subtle glance, waiting for orders. None came. The Admiral remained still, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze locked on Alex. The silence deepened, now tinged with expectation. Every person in the hall knew something monumental was about to happen, though none could name it yet. The young ensign who had whispered earlier gripped his glass so tightly his knuckles whitened. He could feel his pulse racing, though he was only an observer. Why was he nervous? Because he realized he wasn't watching a simple arrest. He was witnessing a clash of principles far larger than himself. In one corner, a colonel leaned toward his aide. This isn't about her anymore. This is about what she represents. And that was the truth. Alex Morgan was not just a person in chains. She was a symbol of triumph, of sacrifice, of the dangerous gray line between duty and morality. Her silence forced everyone in that hall to confront their own beliefs about war, about orders, about honor. Was she a traitor? Or was she the only one brave enough to do what was right? The silence demanded an answer, but no one dared speak it aloud. At last, Alex shifted slightly, adjusting her stance. The chains rattled softly, a cruel reminder of her captivity. But that tiny sound was enough to break the spell. Heads turned sharply, breaths caught, as if the entire room had been waiting for her to move. Still, she said nothing. The Admiral finally stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the floor, each step echoing like a gavel. The MPs stiffened. The audience leaned forward, and though the Admiral's lips had not yet parted, the silence grew even heavier, because everyone knew whatever came next would decide whether Alex Morgan's name would be remembered as a cautionary tale, or a legend reborn. The ballroom doors swung open once more, their hinges groaning like the opening act of a courtroom drama. Every head turned toward the entrance, as if pulled by the same invisible cord. Admiral James Harrington stepped inside. He didn't need fanfare, nor did he command silence. It was already his. His presence alone was gravity, and the room orbited around him. The white of his dress uniform gleamed under the chandeliers, adorned with rows of ribbons and medals that spoke of decades of service. His shoes clicked against the floor with deliberate precision, each step measured, unhurried, and devastatingly controlled. This was no ordinary officer. Harrington was the kind of man whose reputation traveled ahead of him, whispered through corridors long before his arrival. To the young sailors in the room, he was a name from manuals and case studies, a figure of discipline, strategy, and uncompromising command. To the veterans, he was a peer, a survivor of countless battles both in combat zones and in the political minefields of the Pentagon. But tonight, to everyone, he was judgment incarnate. The MPs stiffened as Harrington entered, their spines snapping straight, their grips tightening around Alex's arms. Not out of fear that she would resist, but out of fear that their own imperfections might be noticed in his presence. Harrington's eyes swept the room like a searchlight, pausing on no one yet seeing everyone. He did not acknowledge the decorated captains, the nervous recruits, or the veterans shifting in their chairs. His gaze was too sharp, too deliberate. He was searching for one person only. And then his eyes locked onto Alex Morgan. The air changed. For the first time since she had been escorted into the hall, Alex shifted slightly. Her spine remained straight, her shoulders square, but there was a subtle acknowledgement in the tilt of her head. Not deference, not shame, but recognition. These two had history. Harrington stopped midway across the hall, hands clasped behind his back. He studied her with a gaze that was both piercing and unreadable. Years of command had honed his ability to reveal nothing, to wear a mask that concealed even his own doubts. But beneath that polished exterior lay a mind calculating every detail: her stance, her silence, the weight of the eyes watching them both. The room was a powder keg, and he was holding the match. Slowly, deliberately, Harrington resumed walking. The crowd parted without being told, chairs scraping quietly as officers and sailors shifted to create a clear path. The click of his shoes on the marble floor echoed like a drumbeat. As he drew closer, whispers swelled again, softer this time, reverent. "That's Harrington. God, look at him. He doesn't even blink. He's the one who signed off on her missions, isn't he?" Alex kept her gaze steady, refusing to bow or break eye contact. She had looked at warlords, terrorists, and death itself through her scope. She would not look away from Harrington. When he finally stopped, it was only a few feet from her. The space between them buzzed with tension, like the charged air before a lightning strike. The Admiral let the silence breathe. He was a master of it. In his long career, he had learned that words spoken too quickly carried little weight. But silence made people lean in, desperate for meaning. And now, every soul in that hall was leaning toward him, hungry for his verdict. For a long moment, he said nothing. His eyes roamed Alex's face, searching for cracks in her composure. But she gave him none. At last, his voice broke the stillness. "Commander Morgan." It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. His tone was low, resonant, commanding in its simplicity. The kind of voice that cut through battlefield chaos, the kind of voice men and women instinctively obeyed. The use of her title sent another ripple through the crowd. He hadn't called her prisoner or retired officer. He had called her by her rank, as though stripping it from her was not his right, at least not yet. Alex inclined her head slightly. "Admiral." The single word hung heavy in the air. She spoke it without emotion, without bitterness, without deference. Just acknowledgement. Harrington's eyes narrowed. The MPs glanced nervously at one another. They had expected shouting, accusations, perhaps even an official statement. Instead, this was something deeper, something far more dangerous. A confrontation of equals, even though one stood free and the other stood in chains. The silence stretched once more. Harrington let his gaze sweep the audience before returning to Alex. He could feel their eyes on him, waiting for him to unravel the mystery, waiting for him to cast judgment. But Harrington knew better than to give them easy answers. He had lived long enough to understand the power of restraint. He remembered Alex's rise through the ranks. He had read her reports, signed off on her deployments. He had seen her kill counts, her commendations, her spotless record. He had also seen the classified files, the ones locked away in safes, detailing missions that could never see the light of day. Missions that tested not just skill, but morality. And he remembered the last report, the one that ended her career. The one that carried his signature, though he had not written the words. A mission gone wrong. A sniper who had disobeyed. Civilians saved. A target escaped. A scandal buried. Now here she stood, the past dragged into the light. Harrington exhaled slowly, his voice calm but edged like steel. You understand why you're here? Alex's eyes flickered, but only for an instant. Yes, sir. Her voice was steady, controlled. She offered no defense, no explanation, just acknowledgement. The Admiral tilted his head slightly, studying her. He could sense the crowd behind him, their curiosity simmering. They wanted a spectacle. They wanted outrage or vindication, or both. But Harrington had no interest in giving them what they wanted. He was here for something greater. He took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough that only those nearest could hear, though the room strained to catch every syllable. This isn't about chains, Commander. This is about choices. Alex's jaw tightened, but she did not look away. For the recruits, this moment was almost unbearable. They shifted in their seats, hearts pounding, knowing they were witnessing something far beyond the scope of their training manuals. For the veterans, it was confirmation of what they already knew. Wars were not just fought with rifles and bombs, but with decisions that haunted far longer than bullets. The Admiral let the silence stretch again. He could feel the tension pressing on every chest in the hall. The weight of history itself seemed to hang in the air. Finally, he turned his head slightly, his gaze sweeping the crowd. His next words would not be just for her. They would be for everyone. And as he drew breath to speak, the silence deepened, heavy with anticipation. Because everyone in that room understood what Admiral Harrington said next would not only define Alex Morgan's fate, it would define theirs. The Admiral's words, "This is about choices," still lingered in the air like smoke after a shot fired. The audience, a sea of uniforms and civilian guests, sat frozen in expectation. They wanted clarity. They wanted to know why one of the Navy's most decorated female snipers was paraded in handcuffs at an event meant to honor service. But Harrington did not hand them answers. Instead, he allowed silence to swell again, forcing the whispers to return. Choices? One officer muttered under his breath. She went rogue, another whispered. I heard she disobeyed orders on her last mission. No, she saved civilians. That's why she's here. The higher-ups don't want that story told. Each rumor slid across the room like a current, growing stronger with each retelling. No one knew the full truth. No one but Alex, and perhaps the man now standing before her. Alex Morgan remained still, her wrists encircled by steel, though she wore her chains like an accessory rather than a punishment. Her eyes stayed locked on Harrington, unwavering. She wasn't here to beg for forgiveness. She wasn't even here to fight for her reputation. She was here because truth had a way of catching up, even when locked in vaults labeled classified. The Admiral turned slightly, his voice sharp and clear. Commander Morgan stands accused of disobedience in the line of duty. The room erupted with murmurs. Some gasped outright. Others nodded as though confirming suspicions long held. Disobedience was no small charge, especially in the SEALs, where discipline was survival. For a sniper, it was unthinkable. But Harrington wasn't finished. Her actions, during an operation that remains restricted in detail, altered the outcome of the mission. Restricted. That word carried more weight than any accusation. It meant the mission was buried under layers of secrecy. It meant none of them, captains, commanders, even retired admirals in the audience, had full access. And yet, here they were, watching its consequences unfold in a ballroom. A young lieutenant leaned toward his superior. What mission? The older man shook his head. Don't ask. If it's restricted, you don't want to know. But everyone wanted to know. Harrington let the anticipation build, then delivered the next blow. By the letter of military law, Commander Morgan's refusal to execute a direct order is insubordination. By its consequences, it is dereliction of duty. The words landed like stones. Insubordination, dereliction. These were career-ending terms, words etched into dishonor. The MPs at Alex's side stiffened, as if the Admiral's words justified their grip on her arms. And yet something in Harrington's tone was strange. It lacked venom. His voice carried not condemnation, but careful precision, as if each word was chosen like a chess move. He wasn't merely reciting charges. He was setting the stage. Alex finally spoke, her voice steady, low, but loud enough to carry across the hall. "You're telling them half a story." The room drew in a collective breath. Harrington's eyes flickered, not surprise, but acknowledgement. He had expected her to respond. "Perhaps," he said calmly. "But half the story is often what people prefer." Whispers grew louder, arguments breaking out among the crowd. She must have done something unforgivable. She saved lives, I heard. Innocent lives. No orders are orders. She knew the risks. For the younger sailors, this was a brutal education. They had entered the service believing in clear lines. Follow orders, win battles, earn honor. But watching Alex Morgan in chains forced them to confront a harsher truth. Sometimes the battlefield wasn't sand or sea, but the gray space between duty and morality. One retired officer finally stood, his voice cracking through the noise. "Admiral, what order did she refuse?" The room went silent again. All eyes returned to Harrington. The Admiral did not answer immediately. His gaze dropped to the floor for a moment, then lifted, hard and unyielding. "That," he said slowly, "remains classified." Groans rippled through the audience. Some muttered accusations of a cover-up. Others leaned forward with deeper fascination. Alex's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, but it was a bitter one. "Of course it does." The Admiral met her eyes again. His silence said more than his words ever could. He knew the truth. She knew the truth. But revealing it here would open doors the Navy preferred closed. Still, the room demanded answers, and in their hunger, they began constructing their own. Theories spun wildly. She let the target go. She fired without clearance. She exposed the team. She protected civilians. Each speculation painted her as hero or villain, traitor or savior. But the true charge, the one locked inside Harrington's carefully measured words, was that she had made a choice. A choice that violated the chain of command. And in the military, the chain of command was sacred. Alex shifted her weight slightly, her chains clinking softly. "Tell them, Admiral. Tell them what you ordered me to do." Gasps rang out. The audacity of speaking to Harrington like that left some stunned, others exhilarated. But the Admiral didn't flinch. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing just enough to convey the storm beneath his calm exterior. He answered her with silence, a silence that shouted louder than any outburst could. It was confirmation without confession. The room shivered with realization. Whatever the order had been, it was unspeakable in this setting. Unspeakable because it wasn't clean. Unspeakable because it wasn't heroic. Unspeakable because war often demanded acts that blurred the line between service and sin. Finally, Harrington broke the silence, his voice steady as stone. "This room is not where the truth belongs." But by then, the damage was done. The crowd no longer needed the specifics. They could see it in Alex's eyes, in Harrington's restraint, in the handcuffs that seemed more symbolic than necessary. The unspoken charges had been laid bare not in detail, but in weight. Alex Morgan had disobeyed an order that most in the room could not imagine taking. And whether she was condemned or revered would depend entirely on which side of morality they stood. Harrington took a step back, clasping his hands once more behind his back. "The charges remain. he said firmly. But understand this. Charges are not the same as judgment. It was both a warning and a promise, leaving the room in a state of electric uncertainty. And as the whispers surged once more, it became clear the truth was no longer hidden. It was alive in the room, breathing through rumor, fueled by silence, and impossible to ignore. The room held its breath. The Admiral's words had set the charges in stone, but Alex Morgan's silence had been the heaviest thing in the hall. Until now. Her wrists, still cuffed, shifted slightly. The faint rattle of steel against steel was the only sound, sharp in the hushed ballroom. She straightened her back, though she had never slouched, and raised her chin, not in defiance, but in clarity. "If you're going to accuse me," Alex said, her voice strong but measured, "then you'll hear my side. You'll hear why." The murmurs that erupted were immediate, nervous, almost frantic. No one expected her to speak so openly, not in this setting, not under the Admiral's gaze. Some leaned forward, eager. Others recoiled, worried she would dig her own grave with words too bold. Harrington remained still. His eyes narrowed ever so slightly, but he did not stop her. He had, in truth, been waiting for this moment. Alex inhaled slowly, and for the first time, her voice carried not just steadiness, but something else. "Wait. It was my last mission. You all know the type classified, black ops. Not even the official records will ever confirm it happened. I was inserted with my team into a desert city already crumbling under warlords and militias. The target was a high-value insurgent, a financier, someone with enough blood on his hands to stain the earth red. My orders were clear: locate, confirm, eliminate. Her words painted the room with imagery. The officers and recruits could almost see it. The dust rising from shattered buildings, the shadows of gunmen lurking on rooftops, the chaos of a city consumed by conflict. "I had him in my sights," she continued. Her eyes grew distant, not unfocused, but reliving. Wind was steady. Distance, 912 meters. My scope was clear, my trigger steady. One breath, one squeeze, and the mission would be complete. The room leaned closer. This was the part none of them had ever read in reports. "But then," Alex said, her tone tightening, "I saw them. Women, children, civilians who had been herded onto the rooftop of the same building where he stood. Human shields. He had placed himself in the middle of them, knowing we would come. He was daring us to fire." Gasps spread through the audience. Some covered their mouths. Others clenched fists against their knees. Alex's voice dropped lower. My comms lit up. The order came fast and sharp. "Take the shot." Silence followed her words, thick as fog. She looked at Harrington now, her eyes steady. "I was told to pull the trigger. Kill the target. End the mission. And damn the rest." Harrington did not move, but the flicker in his jaw betrayed something, a memory, perhaps, or regret. Alex continued, her words clipped, each one cutting. "I had a choice. Do I follow orders, or do I acknowledge what was right in front of me? That pulling that trigger would mean killing not just one guilty man, but dozens of innocent ones, mothers, children, people who had no weapon but the bad luck of standing on that rooftop." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Some recruits looked pale. Veterans shifted uncomfortably, reminded of choices they too had faced in shadows. "I disobeyed," Alex said at last. "I lowered my rifle." Her admission cut through the room like a blade. "I refused to kill them to kill him. I knew what it meant. I knew the cost. I knew my career would be over the second I chose morality over orders. But I would rather stand here in chains than live knowing I executed innocence because someone told me to." Her voice, which had begun steady, now carried fire. That's my crime. That's the charge. That's what they won't write in the files. The murmurs erupted again, louder now. The split in the room was clear. She did the right thing. Someone muttered fiercely. No, she jeopardized the mission, she defied orders, another countered. She saved lives. She disobeyed command. Harrington's silence remained deliberate. He let the chaos of voices grow until the weight of it pressed back into stillness. Alex drew in another breath, and this time her voice softened, not weaker, but deeper, heavier with emotion. I've taken more lives than anyone in this room could count. Each one was an order. Each one left a scar. You don't forget the faces, not if you're honest with yourself. You learn to live with it. But that night, her voice caught slightly, the first crack in her iron tone. That night, if I had fired, I wouldn't have been living with it. I'd have been buried under it. The recruits stared at her like she was a living legend, their rigid notions of honor collapsing into something more complex, more painful. The veterans, however, understood in silence. They had been there, in jungles, deserts, oceans, where orders and humanity collided, and survival demanded compromise. Alex raised her cuffed hands slightly, letting the chains clink. So yes, I disobeyed. I saved lives the rules said I wasn't supposed to. And if that condemns me, then so be it. I'll carry that weight. Better me than the ghosts of those children. The hall was silent again. This time not with uncertainty, but with the suffocating gravity of her confession. She turned her gaze back to Harrington. You wanted me to explain? That's my defense. That's my truth. Do what you will with it. Her words settled over the crowd like dust after an explosion. Some eyes were wet, others hardened. Opinions divided, but no one could deny the force of her testimony. Harrington remained still, his expression unreadable. But inside, his mind burned. He had expected her to speak, but not like this. Not with such devastating clarity. Not with such undeniable humanity. And as the silence stretched, one truth became clear to everyone in the room. Whether hero or traitor, Alex Morgan was no ordinary soldier. She was the embodiment of a question the military itself had never fully answered. When does duty end, and when does conscience begin? The hall was frozen in the aftermath of Alex Morgan's words. Her confession, her defense, her fire, it still hung in the air like smoke after a battlefield detonation. No one moved. No one breathed too loudly. The recruits, the veterans, the officers, all of them sat suspended between two truths, the sanctity of orders and the sanctity of life. And now, all eyes turned to Admiral James Harrington. For a long moment, he remained absolutely still, his hands folded neatly behind his back, his gaze fixed on Alex. He could have been carved from stone, and yet the pressure radiating from him was palpable. He had mastered the art of silence, and now he wielded it like a weapon. Finally, he spoke. Choices, Harrington said, his voice low but carrying across the room. That's what this comes down to. Not orders, not missions, not medals or commendations. Choices. His tone was sharp, deliberate, each word striking like a hammer against steel. Every soldier in this room knows the oath they swore. To obey, to follow, to place the mission above themselves. That chain of command is what keeps chaos from consuming us. Without it, there is no discipline, no unity, no survival. Several officers nodded, relief in their eyes. This was the Harrington they expected, the hardline Admiral, the Iron Commander. But Harrington's gaze didn't leave Alex, and yet he let the words hang, dangerous, deliberate. There are choices that no oath can prepare you for. Situations where obedience collides with humanity, where the mission collides with the very principles we claim to defend. The room stirred uneasily. The recruits looked around, as if unsure whether they were allowed to agree. The veterans, however, leaned in. They knew exactly what he meant. Harrington began to pace, slow, precise. His voice grew heavier, not louder, but filled with the weight of decades of command. I have given orders that ended lives. I have signed papers that sent men and women into missions they would not return from. And I have carried those decisions every day since. That is the burden of command. But what you all must understand, he stopped, turning sharply to face them, is that leadership is not blind obedience. It is judgment. The words cut through the silence. Harrington stepped closer to Alex, his eyes locked onto hers, unflinching. Commander Morgan made a judgment. She defied an order, yes. She broke the chain, yes. But she also saved lives. The recruits gasped softly. Some clutched at their knees, their rigid training at war, with the truth in his words. She chose humanity over the mission, Harrington continued, his voice steady as stone. And that is both her crime and her honor. Murmurs erupted again, louder this time, fueled by the paradox he laid bare. How could it be both? Harrington raised a hand, and the noise died instantly. His authority was absolute. I will not tell you she was right, he said firmly. And I will not tell you she was wrong. Because war is not math. It is not black and white. It is mud and blood and choices that stain the soul. His voice lowered, carrying a weight that pressed on every chest. You can debate orders and oaths in classrooms. But on the battlefield? Sometimes all that remains is what you can live with when the sun rises again. Alex's eyes softened, just slightly. For the first time since the Admiral had entered, she saw not just a commander, but a man who carried ghosts of his own. Harrington straightened his back. His next words would be remembered by everyone in the room. Make no mistake, he said. Disobedience cannot be excused. If every soldier chose which orders to follow, the military would collapse. But neither can we ignore the courage it takes to place morality above obedience when the cost is this great. He paused, letting the paradox settle in the air like a blade balanced on its edge. So here is my response to you, Commander Morgan. He turned back to her fully, his voice like thunder wrapped in restraint. You are guilty, and you are honorable. Both truths exist, and both will follow you for the rest of your life. The room went utterly silent. The recruits stared in awe, their rigid notions of service shattered. The veterans sat heavy with memory, nodding in grim acknowledgement. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure how history would judge what they had just witnessed. Alex herself did not flinch. Her face remained steady, her posture firm. But inside, something loosened. Not relief, never that, but a recognition that her truth had been spoken aloud and not dismissed. Harrington stepped back, clasping his hands once more behind him. You all came here expecting a scandal, a trial, a punishment. But what you've seen tonight is something far greater. You've seen the cost of command, the cost of conscience. And you would do well to remember it, because one day, each of you will face your own impossible choice. And in that moment, no manual, no regulation, no admiral will be there to guide you. Only yourself. He swept the room with his gaze, pinning every soul under its weight. Do not forget this night. His words echoed, heavy and final. Then, in one sharp motion, Harrington turned to the MPs. His command was crisp, absolute. Remove her cuffs. The clink of unlocking metal rang out, louder than it should have, like a gunshot of liberation. Alex rubbed her wrists briefly, but made no gesture of triumph. She simply stood taller, freer in body, but unchanged in spirit. The room remained silent, caught between awe and confusion. Was this absolution? Was it condemnation? Or was it something deeper, a refusal to let the story be written in ink too simple for the truth. Alex looked at Harrington one last time. Their eyes met, and though no words were exchanged, an entire lifetime of understanding passed between them. He turned sharply, his steps carrying him toward the exit. The crowd parted like water before him, still silent, still processing. And when the doors closed behind him, the weight of his response lingered. Not a verdict, not a lecture, but a mirror forcing every person in that room to confront the same question Alex had faced. When the order comes, and it collides with your humanity, what choice will you make? The ballroom had fallen silent, yet it no longer felt oppressive. The tension that had gripped the room like a vice had loosened, replaced by a peculiar mixture of awe, contemplation, and reverence. The handcuffs that had bound Alex Morgan mere moments ago now lay behind her, a symbol of a story untold yet fully understood. She stood at the center, upright and steady, her uniform immaculate, her medals glinting under the chandelier lights. Every observer felt the gravity of her presence, not as a prisoner, not as a defendant, but as a soldier whose choices had shaped the course of lives she could never forget. Conversations slowly began to ripple through the hall. At first, whispers, as if no one dared speak aloud too quickly, fearing that even words might disrespect what had just transpired. Then, fragments of analysis. She made the call herself, saved civilians at the risk of her career. Her life, that's honor beyond regulations, but disobeying orders. Is that not treason? Veterans leaned back in their chairs, silent, their expressions a mixture of understanding and respect. They had lived in moments like these where survival, morality, and duty collided, and they knew that there were no manuals to navigate the moral wilderness of war. Alex herself did not speak at first. She let the silence speak for her, as she had done countless times in deserts, jungles, and frozen peaks. And yet, in that silence, she was not absent. She was alive, present, commanding attention, not with authority or medals, but with the weight of every choice she had made. One young ensign, unable to resist, approached a senior officer. "Sir, she disobeyed orders, but she saved lives?" The officer nodded slowly. "Yes, and that's something every soldier will one day have to reckon with. Sometimes doing the right thing means breaking the rules, even when it costs you everything else." Across the hall, older SEAL veterans whispered among themselves, nodding in quiet approval. Some recalled the last classified mission, piecing together what they had been allowed to know. They understood that Alex's decision had been unimaginably difficult. Every option carried risk, and yet she chose humanity over strict obedience. Alex turned her gaze toward the far end of the hall, where families of service members watched quietly, some with tears brimming in their eyes. Mothers and fathers of men and women who had deployed understood in a way that words could not convey. They saw courage, sacrifice, and conscience intertwined, a testament to the real cost of war, one often invisible in reports and commendations. Harrington remained near the exit, observing. He had given his response, and now he watched the ripples it created. In the quiet that followed, he noted the subtle shifts in posture, the glances of admiration and doubt, the way the story of one soldier had begun to reshape every mind in that room. Alex finally spoke, her voice steady but softer than before. "Legends are not built on medals or the echo of gunfire," she said. "They're built on choices. Sometimes those choices are praised. Sometimes they are punished. Sometimes no one understands them at all. But the truth is in the moments you live, not the accolades you collect." Her words resonated. They were not a defense, not a plea for sympathy. They were a statement of principle. The audience absorbed them in silence, letting the weight of experience seep into every corner of the room. The young recruits, who had entered the hall with rigid notions of black and white rules, began to comprehend the shades of gray in which real soldiers operate. They understood that courage was not just facing the enemy, it was facing yourself, your conscience, and the consequences of your choices. A senior captain finally spoke aloud, breaking the hushed reverence. "Commander Morgan," he said, his voice deliberate, "your actions have reminded us all that the definition of service is larger than any mission or medal. It's measured in the lives we protect and the humanity we preserve, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's punished." Alex inclined her head slightly, a small gesture, acknowledging the weight of the statement without arrogance. She had done her duty according to her conscience, and that was enough. In the following moments, the energy in the room shifted. Conversations began to flow more freely, though always with reverence. Officers debated the moral complexities of her decision. Recruits listened intently, and veterans quietly nodded, recognizing the story as one that would be told for years. Some families approached her, offering quiet words of gratitude. Others simply watched, absorbing her presence, recognizing in her a symbol of courage and conscience, someone who had made the impossible choice to protect life, even when it conflicted with duty. Harrington finally moved toward her, his steps deliberate, measured. He stopped a few feet away, meeting her eyes. "You've given them a lesson tonight that I could not have taught in months of training," he said quietly, though enough for the closest listeners to hear. "You've reminded us that service is not just obedience, but judgment. That the strength of a soldier is measured as much by conscience as by skill." Alex nodded once. No words were necessary beyond that. Respect passed between them, a mutual acknowledgement of experience, sacrifice, and understanding. The crowd began to applaud, first hesitantly, then with growing intensity. Not a celebration of victory, not a triumph of medals, but a recognition of the weight of courage and moral clarity. The applause was a tribute, not just to Alex, but to the very essence of what it meant to serve. As the event concluded, Alex walked from the center of the hall, free in body and resolute in spirit. The whispers continued behind her, but now they were tinged with reverence rather than judgment. Outside the ballroom, the night sky stretched over the naval base, calm and indifferent. Yet for those who had witnessed Alex Morgan's story, nothing would ever be the same. They had seen a soldier make the impossible choice, and in doing so, they had glimpsed the true meaning of legacy. Harrington watched her leave, knowing that the story would live on far longer than any report or order. It would be remembered not in the formal annals of the Navy, but in the hearts and minds of those who had seen courage, conscience, and humanity collide in a single act. And Alex Morgan, the retired SEAL sniper once in handcuffs, had ensured that her story would not be defined by chains, by orders, or by misunderstanding, but by the enduring power of choices made with integrity, even when the cost was everything. As she disappeared into the night, the hall slowly emptied, each person carrying a piece of her story with them. Lessons lingered like a shadow, that courage is not always loud, that duty sometimes requires disobedience, and that legacy is forged not in glory, but in conscience. In that moment, Alex Morgan's life was no longer just her own. It belonged to every soldier, every recruit, and every individual who would one day face impossible choices and have to decide what it truly meant to serve. The story would be told, retold, and honored, not as a scandal, but as a lesson in courage, conscience, and the unbreakable spirit of a soldier. And that, more than medals, more than orders, more than chains, was the legacy Alex Morgan had earned.